Okay, we're coming to the home stretch of chapter 1 in Gemara Sotah, 14b, Yudal Amud Aleph, 14a, Yudal Amud Aleph. Yesterday we talked about the idea of following in God's ways. God is a consuming fire, and therefore attaching yourself directly to God is all-consuming and transcendent. And therefore, the way to connect is by following God's ways. And God's way specifically was helping those in need. The Gemara described it on the literal level, but also on the spiritual level, helping those in need spiritually. Specifically, the Gemara identified the 4 things: making clothing, giving clothing to those who don't have, visiting the sick, comforting the mourner, and burying the dead. And the Gemara cites the 4 verses where God does that. So where God clothes the naked, clothes those who need clothing, the Gemara quotes the verse where God provides clothing for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when they first realized that they were naked. So having discussed that, the Gemara now discusses the details of that story. It says the Gemara. It quotes the verse which says, K'soines ar. On the face of it, the translation is, there's 2 words, K'soines and ar. K'soines means like a cloak or a tunic, something like that. And ar means of leather or just leather. So Rav and Shmuel dispute. Chad Amar, one of these 2, Rav or Shmuel, presumably Rav, who's the first one, and therefore he'd be quoted first. Amar, he says that when it says a cloak, leather, it means not an actual leather cloak, but dover haba min ha'ar. It's a cloak made out of that which comes from leather, namely wool. Wool is shorn from leather. Wool, sheep fur is taken from leather. Leather is the skin of the animal.
Oh, right.
So it doesn't mean leather clothing, but that which is taken from leather. That is to say, taken from the skin of the animal, or it means leather and skin.
Yeah,
so taken from.
Yeah, like sheepskin leather, basically.
Right, so it's not the actual leather, it's that which grows from the leather, namely the wool.
Right.
Right, the wool.
Right.
The sheep, the hide's the leather, but that which comes from the hide is the wool. So the first interpretation is that's talking about wool. And the fact that it refers to it as a cloak, leather, it means cloak that emerged from leather, not an actual leather cloak. It means wool. This is first view. The other view is Shmuel, davar sha'or nena mimena, is something, not something that comes from leather or comes from skin, wool, but rather something which the skin enjoys, namely that which comes from flax, I think means cotton.
And flax is the fabric also.
Right, flax is linen.
Linen, yeah.
Also be linen then. Linen. So this is the dispute. Is it that which comes from leather, wool, or is it that which leather, as in the human skin, enjoys, namely linen? This is the end of the discussion on this topic. I'm a little bit perplexed there. Never mind the spiritual significance of wool versus linen. That's something that I can think of some ideas. We have the idea of not mixing wool and linen in the Torah, because wool represents one spiritual level and linen represents a different one, and they're not supposed to mingle. And maybe that's the discussion here: which spiritual level God provided for them was it wool versus linen? But I think, where I'm perplexed is on the literal level. What's wrong with saying it's leather? What's wrong with saying that God provided leather? Why are they looking to say it's not leather? So the Maharsha mentions from the Chizkuni that animals were not as prevalently available at times, right at the beginning of creation. So to go kill an animal to make leather big enough for 2 of them would have been like, wouldn't have been wise at the time, considering that animals hadn't expanded their territory and procreated as much as, today we breed animals a dime a dozen. So you can kill an animal and you still have another one to take its place. But at the beginning of creation, it wasn't like that.
Right.
That's what Maharsha seems to be implying. And therefore, the 2 of them find some other solution for what kind of clothing it was. Wool, which doesn't kill the animal, or just linen. Right?
It's kind of like the way in Israel now, right? So they don't have sheep, like street for cows so much. It's really all imported, the meat. They use it
Yeah,
because they use it more for dairy and they don't want to.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a question of supply and demand. So the supply and demand of animal hide is the cost is too high. But wool is easy to do, or linen is easy to do.
Right, 'cause it grows back.
Yeah, exactly.
Shoot the sheep.
So that would seem to be there. But I'm asking, that would seem to be the simple reading as to why they're not sticking with actual leather, even though the simple reading seems to be leather, right? It's ketonis, a cloak or a leather. And they're interpreting, no, it's a cloak that comes from leather, or a cloak that leather enjoys, meaning the skin enjoys. It's supposed to just keeping it to literal. And this is what the Mashal is explaining, because leather is not an available commodity at the time.
If you're perplexed about that,
Yeah.
I'm perplexed about something else.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Kohen is not supposed to be near a dead body. What are you doing wearing leather? It comes from a dead body.
Not a human, though. Not a human. It's not from a human being.
But we're not supposed to be near a dead animal either.
Once leather is worked, the halacha changes, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Once leather is worked, and it's now turned, right, but once it's turned into a keli, once it's turned into a vessel, it loses its status as the original impurity, if I'm not mistaken. Pretty sure. Anyway, so I'm going to add, though, here's where I want to learn more, is you'll remember we talked about this dispute between Rav and Shmuel. We had a few of these disputes about the cave of Machpelah. Was it a cave in a cave or a cave on top of a cave? Right, the double, what's the nature of the double? Whether it was the same king who made it as if he didn't know Joseph, or was it actually a new king? It's all Rav and Shmuel. And we said that the Rebbe explained that whenever there's a dispute between Rav and Shmuel, the dispute is, do we go after the context or the literal interpretation? So a similar thing would be here, and I want to figure out exactly how is that. The literal interpretation would seem to be that which comes from the leather, and the context means that which leather enjoys, the linen. I could think of why, but I'm not 100% certain. The literal interpretation, I guess, is because it says the word leather in reference to the hide, in reference to the clothing, and the literal would be that the clothing itself somehow is related to the leather, and thus it's wool, which comes from leather. As opposed to the context is, we're trying to make it comfortable for Adam and Eve, and apparently linen is more comfortable.
So linen is first coat, on top of the
Or the wool's on top, what you mean?
wool,
Right, that would be a violation of mixing wool and linen.
but that was before they.
Right, but before the giving of Torah. Yeah, but okay, so it could be they both exist simultaneously, even though the simple reading of the Gemara is that it's a dispute. Anyway, okay, so there's that. Yeah, we're clear. Gemara tells us now further. Rabbi Simlai, on this topic, Rabbi Simlai taught Torah, the narrative of the Torah. Tchilasa begins Kamilas Chasadim, with acts of kindness. The Sotah and the narrative of Torah concludes Kamilas Chasadim with acts of kindness. Tchilas at the beginning, Kamilas Chasadim, the opening of the narrative describes acts of kindness. As the verse reads, that God made for Adam and Eve these clothing and clothed them. So the narrative of Torah opens up with God interacting with man and providing for them, giving them clothing. The Sotah and the narrative of Torah concludes with Kamilas Chasadim, with acts of kindness. As the verse reads, and God buried Moshe Rabbeinu. So the narrative begins with God providing for Adam and Eve. And the narrative ends with God providing for Moses and burying him. It also matches the life cycle. The first thing a parent provides for a child is clothing. It's naked, born naked. And at the end of life, the last thing we provide is their burial. So the narrative of Torah begins with clothing someone and burying someone. And narrative of life begins that way. The kindness that a person receives. A person's incapable of clothing himself when he's born, and a person's incapable of burying himself when he dies. So the beginning and end of life, a person is at the mercy or kindness of others. That's the narrative of Torah. God provides clothing for Adam and Eve and provides burial for Moshe Rabbeinu. Further, we have the Gemara, which famously says, anyone who says I have nothing other than Torah doesn't even have Torah. So a person who has Torah but lacks in kindness and good deeds, then even his Torah is called into question. Because you see it right here, Torah's narrative begins and ends with kindness. And if a person says, "Oh, I'm an intellectual, I'm the learning type," don't bother me with helping other people. Leave it for the simple guys who can't learn. His Torah is called into question. I feel Torah in life, even his Torah doesn't have. And this is reflected in the very text of Torah. Opens with kindness and closes with kindness. Okay. Another statement from Rabbi Simloi related to this saga of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. Rabbi Simloi further taught, why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu so desired to go into Israel? Why did he really want to do that? Did Moshe Rabbeinu really care to eat the fruit of Israel? Or to get satisfied from the goodness of it? Did he need that? Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't care for the fruits, couldn't care for the vegetables, and didn't care for the lands and the peaks and the valleys. It's not why he wanted Israel. So what did he want Eretz Yisrael for? Ella, rather, Moshe Rabbeinu. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu says. There are so many commandments the Jews were commanded. And they are not fulfilled unless we go into Israel. So let me into the land of Israel, so that I can actually fulfill them all. So I can fill them all. So he didn't want to go to Israel for this, the gain, the physical gain of the food and the goodness of Israel. And perhaps it doesn't just mean he doesn't want to go in for the physical, but even the spiritual. I'm not going there for the spiritual ecstasy of Israel, but because in Israel I can fulfill your will, God. I can fulfill your will. I can do your mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs that we can't do until we go to Israel. So Amalek Kadosh Baruch Hu. So God said to Moshe Rabbeinu, what do you really want here? To get the reward. So I'm going to consider it as if you did all the mitzvahs and you'll get your reward. As the verse reads, therefore I'm going to give him a portion amongst the many. And with the mighty ones, he will take part in this spoils. And the verse continues, and he's going to analyze the verse in a moment, and we'll do that in a second. But I just want to comment on the following. Okay, so the simple narrative is he doesn't care for the physical food and the physical beauty of Israel. He cares for serving God. God says to him, don't worry about it. You'll get the reward as if you serve me. Perhaps this means deeper, like this. I don't care for the fruit of Israel. I don't care for the spiritual bliss of Israel. I care because I want to do your mitzvahs, God. So God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, what do you want in mitzvahs? The act? Not what you're looking for. You're looking for a connection with me. And that's the reward. The reward of a mitzvah is what do we enjoy in Gan Eden? What do we enjoy in life after death? We enjoy and appreciate the connections we made to Hashem here in this world. So what are you looking for, Moshe Rabbeinu? You're looking for a connection to me. So I'm going to consider this if you're connected to me, and you'll connect to me on the highest level. It's not the act you care for.
You already connected to him.
That's right. And Hashem says, I'm going to make you connected to me as if you did all the mitzvahs in Israel. Those connections will also have been made.
As like a reference for not bringing to Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah. You want to go to Israel because you want to serve me. But what do you want in serving me?
Right.
You want to make connection to me. I'm going to give you all the connection you can possibly get. Even the connections that would have been achieved or was achieved by others through living in Israel, fulfilling those mitzvahs, you'll get that connection to. Okay, so the Gemara, the verse that supported this idea that Hashem gave him all this kind of reward is from Isaiah 53:12, where it says, and now we're going to analyze the verse. Therefore, I will give him a portion amongst the many, and with the mighty, he will take spoils. Why? Because he put himself on the line of death. He's willing to die for the cause. And amongst the sinners, he counted himself. And he carried the sin of many. And for the sinners, he met. So what does this mean? Explains the Gemara. This is the verse, direct quote. Now explains the Gemara. Therefore, I'm going to give him a portion amongst the multitude. You might think that he gets his portion amongst the multitudes, that is to say, the people of his generation, those latter people who live in his time. But not as much as his predecessors, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. He'll get only commensurate to his people, not to the level of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And therefore, Talmud Sotah, therefore the next line of the verse reads, that amongst the mighty he will divide up, he will get his portion, he'll get his spoils, even amongst the mighty, which is Kavram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Moshe Rabbeinu will get connection to God on the level of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sheinatzumim b'Torah mitzvahs, who are the mighty ones in Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, so first of all, he's going to get like everybody of his generation that are going into Israel. And moreover, not only he'll get the reward, he'll get to the connection to God, just like everybody else in his generation who went into Israel, even though he didn't, he's even going to get a connection to God like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov at the highest possible level. So those are the first two sentences in the verse, that he gets his portion amongst the multitude, getting the reward of those who go into Israel. And from the mighty, he gets the spoils. Amongst the mighty, he gets the spoils. That is to say, even the level of the mighty ones, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are forefathers. Now the next verse is, why is he getting all this reward? Because Tachas Asher Hera Lam, Tachas Asher, what's the pronunciation? Yeah, Tachas Asher Hera Lam was Nafshe, Lamavis Nafshe, because he put his life on the line to die. There's Poshim Nimna and counted himself amongst the sinners. Wait, 1 second. Oh, sorry, I went back a second. Yeah, the verse says the reason why he gets all this is because he put himself on the line to die. When did he do that? Moshe Rabbeinu allowed himself to be put to the death. When is that? As the verse reads, Moshe Rabbeinu says, and if not, take me out of your book. I'm done. So Moshe Rabbeinu is going to die for the truth of the connection to the people, his dedication to the people, beyond dedication to Torah, beyond dedication to the Torah says these guys violated, let them all die. They violated, they did the sin of the golden calf. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm out. You do that, I'm out. I'm going to die. Right? And for who did he do this for? The sinners. He did this for the sinners. He's going to die to protect sinners. This should blow your mind.
I mean, I'm having a hard time trying to wrap my head around it. Like what?
Moshe Rabbeinu says, if you're the kind of God and your relationship with the people is going to be such that, like that, you're willing to wipe them all out, I am not interested. I'm checked out.
Wow.
Mind blowing.
But he could challenge.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, and he changes God's mind. Wow. He changes God's mind. Even though there are people who die in that era, I think the verse says 3,000 people died, but certainly not the amount that should have, which is everybody except for him.
Yeah.
Right. And he says, no, I'm done. I'm out. If you do that, I'm out. Right.
It's amazing, like the balance of like reverence and giving it to him, so to speak.
When they ever talked about this, they ever cried deeply about the deepness of his nefesh, deep self-sacrifice of Moshe Rabbeinu. They ever cried tremendously. Famous Simchas Torah for bringing. Those who were there described it as something out of this world. They couldn't get through the sentences. Bawling his eyes out, describing this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu is willing to put everything on the line, even his very essence, which is Torah itself. Moshe Rabbeinu is Torah. What else is Moshe Rabbeinu? He says, I'm out of Torah if you destroy the people. Wow. Take me out of your Torah. I'm ready to die, like the Gemara says here, if you're going to abandon the people. They ever cried tremendously.
Abraham,
anyway.
And him. Whenever they talk, the three.
Yeah.
Big three.
Look, with Moshe Rabbeinu, we get something on a whole other level. The verse says, "V'aminu b'Hashem v'Moshe Abdei," and the people believed in God and Moses' his servant, equating the belief in God to belief in Moses. I don't think it's higher than that.
Right.
It's a verse we say it every morning. V'aminu b'Hashem v'Moshe Abdei, and they believed in God and Moses' his servant. Belief in Moses is equivalent to the belief in God. This is huge.
Wow. Yeah.
And here that's what the Gemara is saying, that when the verse says that Moshe Rabbeinu got all the reward at the highest levels, it's because he's willing to die for the people.
So
and the verse continues,
Yeah. So much so exactly like the Torah is called the 5 books of Moses.
That's right. Torah's Moshe.
Torah's Moshe, yeah.
That's right.
I know, still.
That's right.
He should be.
That's what we're saying. He is. The Gemara is telling us that he is.
But most people don't recognize it. Because all they hear is Abraham, Isaac, and
Yeah.
Jacob.
I hear that.
Sorry. Yeah. It seems almost, I don't know. I don't want to say, but it kind of be like Moshe is like almost like a deity. I know it's not. I know he's not, but like, I don't know.
Moshe Rabbeinu is a translucent intermediary.
Right.
He has no individual identity other than transmitting God's word.
Right.
And therefore, what he brings to you
right.
is your connection to Hashem.
Right.
Understand?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
That's the function of a Rebbe, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a story that makes the point. It's a similar story, not exactly the same thing. The story goes like this. There was someone who is not friendly to Hasidus and Chabad, came to the Rashbatz. Rashbatz is a famous chassid, a very clever Jew who was a teacher of the previous Rebbe when he was younger. Rashbatz. The story goes, somebody asked him, someone who this fellow is not so keen on Hasidic lifestyle, comes and tells him, says, who do you think is greater? Trying to catch him, Who's greater, Moshe Rabbeinu or your Rebbe? Trying to catch the chassid. So whatever the chassid says, like he's foot in his mouth. He says his Rebbe is greater than Moshe Rabbeinu who received Torah at Sinai. If he says Moshe Rabbeinu is greater, then he's belittling his Rebbe. Well, what is he going to do? He's trying to catch the chassid. But this chassid is a very clever man and said, I have no idea who's greater. But I can tell you one thing. If not for the Rebbe, I have no idea what a Moshe Rabbeinu is. Understand? Without a Moshe Rabbeinu, what God do you have? You don't have a God. God exists. Yeah, so he exists. But what God do you have if you don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu?
Right.
Say, Aminu B'Hashem, because of Moshe Abdai. Because they believe in Moshe, his servant, that's why you have belief in God. They go together. If the verse were to say they believed in God, and they also believed in Moses, as if they're two separate beliefs, that would sound like two gods, God forbid.
Right.
But the verse is saying, by Hashem, Uva Moshe Abdai.
Yeah, right.
They believed in God and Moses' servant, because belief in Moses' servant is what gave them belief in God.
Right.
That's what gave them their God.
Yeah.
Aya lekecha Yisrael. Now, where is your God, O Israel? This is what the verse cries. This is Moshe Rabbeinu's cry to the Jewish people. Where's your God? Here it is. Right?
Yeah, because when I was secular, I knew Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, everybody.
Yeah. To know what Moshe Rabbeinu is, you need a Rebbe. That's the idea. So to know what God is, you need a Moshe Rabbeinu. You need a Rebbe to tell you what God is.
I need you to teach us.
Every Jew, and from one person, everybody learns. It's reciprocal in every direction. We all have that spark in Moshe Rabbeinu, right? It's the spark of Moshe Rabbeinu within.
So speaking out loud, so to have his kashrus to Moshe Rabbeinu is to be his kashrus to the Eibishter.
Precisely. Precisely. Chapter 2 of Tanya.
Right. Another thing we've never known on our own.
Sure.
It was taught to us.
For sure. Sure. So Moshe Rabbeinu says in the Torah, I stand between you and God. There's two types of in-betweens. There's in-between that separates. I want to keep you apart from you, so I'm going to stand in between. So that you guys don't get into a fight. Talk to me, you talk to me, and we're going to stand and moderate. That's one kind of intermediary. Sometimes it's necessary. Two parties that are at odds, or two parties that fight when they're together. So you put someone in the middle to separate and keep the peace. But then there's another kind of intermediary, in which two parties have no relationship. You have one person in the middle who has a relationship with both that can make the flow of the relationship go.
Right.
And that's Moshe Rabbeinu's job, not to be an intermediary that separates between God and Jewish people. It's an intermediary that connects. Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the translucent medium through which the divine energy flows to the Jewish people, so they can know what God is. They can connect with God at all.
Most of what he did,
Which is why he says he's half man, half God, not because he's actually God, God forbid, but because even living as a human being, he had he lived in this paradox where the deepest understanding of godliness and deepest connection to godliness and still remain a human being. So he can talk to you and I on human level, but at the same time, he contains within him the ultimate connection to God, which would seem like you shouldn't be human if you have ultimate connection to God, right?
Right.
That's the Moshe Rabbeinu, that's the job of the Moshe Rabbeinu, to be this.
And he was human too.
Precisely.
He was like, he was taken out of the river as a baby.
That's right, total human.
And
Complete, that's right, that's the point.
that's
right.
He was like.
That's right. That's the point, yeah. Can you say something?
Wow.
well, because with Moshe Rabbeinu, every decision he made, he asked God first.
Sure. Except for when it comes to defending the people.
And most
When it comes to defending the people, he doesn't ask God for permission. He defends right away.
And most of the words in Deuteronomy, when the speeches, it came through God.
For sure. The only thing he doesn't ask God for is to defend the people. When he doesn't listen to God otherwise, like hitting the rock, supposed to talking to the rock, he gets punished. But he's not punished for defending the people.
Right.
In fact, God says at the end, thank you for defending. And here we see also, because he put his life on the line for the people, That's what the Gemara said. This is the reason why he's counted amongst the mighty. He's counted amongst Avram Tzedakah because he's going to die. And the verse goes on, it's concluding lines of the chapter. There's Paishim Nimna. The verse reads, he's counted amongst the sinners, meaning to say, Shem Nimna and Mesa Midbar. He's counted amongst those who died in the desert. His entire generation died out in the desert because they sinned with the sin of the spies. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't abandon them, he stayed with them. And that's why he's being rewarded, because he stays with his people, even when they're in a state of sinning. Likewise, so the verse continues and says, he, Moshe Rabbeinu, carried this weight, carried the sin of the masses. This is Shekiper al Maisa Egel. He effectuated atonement for the sin of the golden calf. In addition to defending the people that they shouldn't be killed, that's one thing. God can say, okay, I'm not killing anybody because you defended them, but I'm not going to say I'm going to cleanse their sin. They still have a stain. Moshe Rabbeinu even effectuated cleansing, building the Mishkan, the Kabbanas, the whole process he did to make sure the people were cleansed, to give them on Yom Kippur. That's where Yom Kippur comes from. Yom Kippur comes from the original time the Jews were forgiven for the golden calf. And this is all accomplished by Moshe. So not just that Moshe put his life on the line to defend the people, they shouldn't be killed, but he actually effectuates that they should be cleansed as well. That God should love them again, not just not kill them. God could say, okay, I'm not killing them on your behalf, but I don't like them anymore. No, Moshe Rabbeinu restored the relationship with them, that they even were cleansed, they were even atoned, and Hashem loves them again, which is what the Mishkan accomplished, right? The presence of God is here, and now it's it. We no longer carry the stain of the golden calf, even though on some level we still do carry the stain a little bit, but overall there's the cleansing. The verse continues, and he meets the sinners. Now, the meeting of the sinners, the Gemara interprets it not that he met the sinners, but that he meets God on behalf of the sinners. That is to say, he prays to God that the sinners of Israel be inspired to do teshuvah. This is the role of the Rebbe, bringing about the relationship between God and the Jewish people. First, by appeasing God that he should forgive, and effectuating that the Jew himself should do teshuvah to reconnect. Both directions. Moshe Rabbeinu does both. Effectuate from God that he reconnect the Jewish people to atone, not to kill, and not to punish, and so on. And likewise, he also prays and beseeches and inspires that the Jews themselves should return. And this is reflected in the verse, in the word of the verse, which says, he meets on behalf of the sinners. What does meeting mean? Meeting is a reference to prayer. As the verse reads, Va'ata and you, this is a verse in Isaiah, in Yirmiyah, where God says, Va'ata and you, do not pray on behalf of these people. Do not raise up on their behalf a song and a prayer. And don't meet me, says God. Reference to prayer. So we see from here that prayer is a reference to, or meeting is a reference to prayer. When it says that Yitzchak by Yifka b'makom, he met the place, say our sages, he met the place. It means he prayed there. Meeting in scripture is a reference to prayer. And therefore, when the verse here says, as part of the reasons why he's getting this lofty level of reward, because he met with the sinners, what it means is he prayed on behalf of the sinners. Prayed that what? That they should do teshuvah. This is how the Gemara concludes this chapter. On this high note of number one, the Gemara, how the narrative of Torah opens up and closes with kindness. That's number one. Number two, telling you what a Jewish leader is, what a Moshe Rabbeinu is, willing to die for the people, for the sinners. Everything has to do with sinners here. He's willing to die for the sinners. He's counted amongst the sinners. He stays with his people in the desert, even though they sinned. He effectuates that God forgive the sinners. He effectuates that the sinners do teshuvah. All the praises here, why Moshe Rabbeinu got this high level, is not because of his prowess. And nowhere does it say here, why does he get the reward of Moshe of Avram Yitzchak Yaakov? Because he learned Torah at the loftiest level. Doesn't say that here. Doesn't say that. All the things listed here are his intercedence on behalf of sinners amongst Israel. And this connects to the previous statement, which was that Torah opens and closes with kindness. Spiritual kindness too. Spiritual kindness. And that's truly what made Moshe Rabbeinu who he is. And that's the lesson we take here. With all the Torah learning and all the, like we talked about yesterday, all the lofty ecstasy we feel when we're learning and we're praying and we feel like the expression in Yiddish goes, we're grabbing angels. That's the expression in Yiddish. We're flying high, we're grabbing angels. Says the Gemara, visit the sick, kindness, clothing the naked. Torah opens and closes with kindness. And a Moshe Rabbeinu, and there's nobody who has a better connection of ecstasy and Torah learning than Moshe Rabbeinu. And yet, what's his greatest achievements? What gives him the great rewards? He's willing to stand up for the sinners. Put his life on the line to defend the sinners, to inspire teshuvah in the sinners. That's the true virtue of Moshe Rabbeinu. The true test of your Torah learning is your ability to help somebody else, physically and spiritually.
And that's a proof also when he said, take me out of your book.
Yeah,
It's a proof that
that's right. Take me out of Torah if you're going to kill the people.
God dictated
That's
the
right.
Torah to Moshe.
And Moshe says, take me out if you're going to kill the people. I'm not part of such a program.
And that's a proof that God did the Torah. God wrote the Torah.
Oh, because he
Take
says,
your
yeah,
book.
yeah,
It's your book. It's
right.
not my book.
Take me out of the book that you wrote. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, you can have a wonderful day, and this Shabbos is Shabbos of Baruch Elul. Next time we meet, Monday morning is going to be Elul already.
Yeah.
These lessons.
Shofar.
Sorry?
Blow the shofar.
Yeah, it's coming up. The shofar is going to be blown soon. The winds of Teshuvah are blowing through the air. Anyway, so Monday morning, we get back to the law of the Sotah, right? This is what we're learning Talmud Sotah. But because we went into the measure for measure of a Sotah, the Gemara took us on a whole long side journey about measure for measure. Shimshon, Yosef, Moshe Rabbeinu, Miriam, all these different characters who had their measure for measure. And now we come back to the law of the Sotah in chapter 2. God willing, starting on Monday. A wonderful day and a good Shabbos, everybody.